he was a teacher. He was teacher at a kind of a time which with a really different system. There was a really different system of teaching back then. You held out your hat or a box or something, and students would have to put a tuition into the box every time they came to class in order to attend the lecture. So, or maybe they could buy a subscription, perhaps, but the teacher had to be paid directly, and the university was just there to monitor affairs and to assign rooms and so forth. Hi, Stephen. Nice to see you.
I'd like to say something about like the emotions and stuff.
Cool.
I think there's something else, like in Heidegger, he talks about mood. That so I think when so far what we're talking about with emotions are sort of feelings that are kind of like reactive to what's going on, but I think there's also an emotional thing that's about mood, like kind of an overarching purveyor of what's going on that actually leads the experience, so Heidegger has the examples of anxiety or being in love or being depressed, that that determines kind of what's going on. So I think that emotions are something that really haven't been addressed, like in a way like from Hegel, in a very systematic kind of analysis, trying to kind of break down what the heck is going on here, and with the dialectic inside them. I think emotions are a much bigger kind of overarching container, and that container, that concepts are just sort of like part precipitates of emotional mood, a larger thing rather than just feelings, but that there's like an overarching mood that goes on that we're kind of like somehow just hasn't been thought about, I think, or at least I haven't thought about it, and I haven't seen it that much addressed.
Well, it's addressed in psychology, and Hegel did touch on it. Hegel started to address at least emotions. He recognized that emotions were an issue, but I think he felt that the emotions would tend to they were like I think he thought of the emotions as kind of a given in like a given part of human constitution, or the constitution of consciousness, perhaps, or the constitution of the mind, but not necessarily deterministic. In other words, that the emotions were like a attribute. They were like an attribute of living things, so or an attribute of animals. So, like, because emotions are an attribute of animals, we could perhaps judge them in ourselves, and I think that's fair. I don't recall exactly what Hegel said about emotions, but there was something in the introduction, I think, about emotion. I have a document that I'm using where I keep my darkest thoughts, and so yeah, I can search the document just in case I did write something down. Nope, nothing. So, but anybody else have anything to say about that? Because I think it's an important point. I think I want to mostly talk about Hegel tonight, and that was kind of like an introduction of a concept from Heidegger, but it's extremely relevant because Hegel's talking about consciousness and the self. And if the self is emotional, we should have a theory, of what goes into that. So if anyone else wants to speak, they can raise their hand in the participants window, or they can just start talking, whichever.
Well, again, I like to say about it that emotions are kind of like thought, that they're temporal. They're very, they're defined in very temporally, disjunctive things,
Right.
so the mood kind of goes on, but then it shifts into something else, just like
Mm-hmm.
thoughts do, even though thoughts are much more small temporal bits, but the emotions in terms of like a mood, not just a particular emotion like I'm scared or something like that, but a general mood that one has, that drives one on. And to me, that's kind of Hegelian.
Mm-hmm.
It's showing, that it's flipping from one thing to another. And I think that, there can be a very kind of systematic analysis, or trying to kind of figure out what's going on in these like transitions, and is it a dialectic that happens, is one mood into another, something else, or because I think that moods are kind of seen as it's this, and then it's that,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's not given the weight that it really could be. There might be something very deep and powerful involved in it, but we get lost because we just name it as this. We know what it is. Oh, I'm depressed, or I'm hopeful, or this, but it's just like, accepting a naming that's very naive.
Yeah. Well, I'm personally thinking that uh, emotions are similar to objects. When I said attributes, I think that fits into the chapter on perception in Hegel. In other words, something that is not the thing itself. He calls either a property, or a determinate, something determinate, and and the of the thing, in this case, determinate of the animal. So the emotions are definitely should be studyable, I think, in the same way. If the emotions are an attribute of us, then we should be able to basically understand them in a way similar to pure concepts. Um, Although I don't know if Hegel ever gets into how, maybe he does, maybe enforced in the understanding. Yeah, I have to go back. I've only read a little bit of it this time so far.
I was just
So,
wondering about the definition of
yeah.
emotion, though. The definition of emotion is a strong drive.
Right.
Unlike sentiment, we use the word sentiment to describe feelings that we entertain intellectually. But emotions is like, I want to punch your face, or I'm going to chase this girl, or I'm going to start a war. So emotions are very strong sort of drive, whereas sentiments is something we can argue about.
Right. Well, actually, true and false. I mean, the emotions cause a behavior issue, but then so do thoughts. So, in other words, we can either have a strong emotion and perform a behavior, or we can just sort of like think rationally, quote unquote, and perform a behavior. So, it's not necessarily you're not necessarily always wrong when you're emotional. Making a leap is sometimes extremely good. So the emotion is something that I'm thinking maybe it can be treated a lot like a thought. In other words, it might be most productive if we treat it like a thought. And we got some really good comments in the chat. You know, there's the book written by Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made. So you have the horse's mouth. Here's a philosopher who has created a book about it. And yeah, and some chats. Hegel's not a mega psychologist who has a mechanistic theory. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to say, you know, emotions are wrong. There's emotions, I think, are generally looked at as data. They're psychical, they're data. It's an occurrence just like any other sensation. A sensation is not wrong. An emotion is not wrong, but it's available as an internal state, which, you know, has a certain power, just like a certain intensity of light has a certain power. And you're right, it's not the same as thinking, because you can't recall it in the same original form that you experience it, but you can recall it as recounting memory. Whereas a thought, you can recall a thought. So there's a difference, right? But like feelings, you can think about the feeling and recall the feeling in that way. So, I mean, emotions are feelings that drive you to act, and you have to decide whether or not to act. You know, there's an appropriate reaction. Emotion is energy to move and do a certain act. The question of whether you do it or not, whether it's moral, whether it's the most likely successful, it's the thing that the emotion points you to. It's a direction to act and move before you think. Now, whether you think or not is a whole different question. That depends on, you know, what type of person you want to be, are, and what situation, right?
And what are the potential rewards? Your little brain is sweating away thinking, now, if I smack this guy in the face, what's my future going to be? I reckon it looks pretty good after I smack him in the face, so I'm going to smack him in the face.
You do or don't use your frontal cortex. I mean, some people do, some people really don't bother.
Okay. I'm gonna stop this fight right now. It was Lucas who made that comment about Hegel is not a mega psychologist with a mechanistic way of hooking emotions and senses together. Yeah, because he doesn't have a chapter on that. But so we have like my stinking interpretation. We have Lisa Barrett, and the whole comment from the comment from Lucas, which is probably the best here, is that Heidegger could have been historicizing mood in terms of epochs. So I like that comment. The later Heidegger is historicizing moods in terms of epochs. So you could have mood as an epoch of consciousness, perhaps. In other words, some consciousness is not that moody, and you have like moodier consciousness. You know, like if you say that again, I'm going to, you know, punch you in the bells. So this kind of emotionalism can just simply be an extension of normal consciousness. That's more or less directed at you, Stephen. You want to further your argument now?
I'm just thinking like a Yorkshireman at the moment. White Rose. It was in my ancestry. I spent all my life, person keep out of fights, and I don't know, I drank alcohol in the last few years, and I don't know, I'm feeling my more violent side coming out. So the Yorkshire ancestry, avatystic ancestry, has finally emerged.
If you get kicked off of Meetup or out of the group, we could just say it was genetic. Excellent. So,
I wanted
ahead.
to sort of bring the discussion back towards Hegel a little bit. I think the two key emotions in Hegel, at least up to what I've read so far, are like some kind of frustration and then despair, because like every section of the book is like consciousness or self-consciousness or reason, whatever the narrator is at that moment is like struggling to understand something. And they try one way and it doesn't work. They try changing it a bit, it doesn't work. They keep making changes to their method until they realize nothing works. And they realize that their foundational assumptions that they used are wrong, and they fall into like despair. And only through this like deep despair does the next chapter begin and unfold, and a new way of thinking emerges. And that seems to be what happens through the whole book until we get to the end with like the final movement, the Owl of Minerva, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, number 78, which is, I guess, still in the preface. Am I right?
Yes.
No, it's in the introduction. Yeah, it's
No,
in,
it's in the
in the
preface.
introduction, number 78. No, it's the introduction. Yeah, the introduction starts at number 73. So here's my notes. I can just go to the page instead. So good. It's the beginning of the
What's this
introduction.
about, please?
78, huh? We've been talking about emotion and how it relates to Hegel's theory. I think we need to go forward towards a elucidation of Hegel's idea of object, and which was the subject. I think to a certain extent it was supposed to be the reading, assigned reading, but the
What
idea
kind
of
emotion, please?
excuse me.
What kind of emotion?
We're just talking about any emotion, Samuel, but we're relating
Okay,
to
'cause I was
anger,
gonna say-
anger, and fight or flight, things like that, and also
Okay.
despair, which Hegel talks about. I was just gonna
I was gonna
quote.
say if it's
from,
related to the Bible scriptures, because I'm a Christian.
No, not at all. Anyway, but Hegel has a religious side. It just needs to be elucidated. It needs
Does it
to
have a
be
religious bit
expunged.
then, please?
Yeah, it's
Does it have a
difficult.
religious bit, please?
Yes, there's a religious chapter. It starts in the
Okay.
it starts it goes on for about it starts on page 410 of the phenomenology and goes on for about 50 pages, 45 pages.
Because
So
if
anyway-
it has Jesus' name in it, that's good.
That's a big question mark. Anyway, but Hegel was pro-religion, and I think Matt in the lecture even says that Hegel felt that you need something like a religion. You need some kind of a religion going in order to deal with as an individual. You need to be able to have that going in order to deal with what's going on in culture in general. Okay, I'm going to read my notes because it's shorter. I wrote scientific skepticism. This is sort of the idea. One accepts only one's own deed as what is true. That's a quote from Hegel. And then despair about the automatic generation of concepts, thoughts, and opinions is what makes the consciousness available for the first time to investigate what is the process by which we create the truth through the reification of the self. So the emotion of despair for Hegel is what is part of what creates the in the consciousness to make itself the medium.
Sorry to interrupt.
For the would you stop interrupting me?
Okay, is Hegel
Would you stop interrupting me, please? Look, if you want to talk, you put your name on the participants window, put your hand up in the participants window, and we'll let you speak, okay? So the basically the consciousness is always concerned about something. We know that, right? And since the consciousness is always concerned about something, the process by which we create truth, and according to Hegel, it's the through the reification of the self that we create the truth. So that's where despair comes in. Despair is kind of like the emotion that Hegel singles out as being the genesis of the occasion for consciousness to try to discover what is the truth and to try to form it out of our own process, out of our own activity. Mental, experiential, and so forth. Whose hand is up? David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Samuel's raising his hand in his window because he doesn't know about the maybe the participants window where you
Yeah, at the
click.
bottom of the screen, you can click on participants. You get a little side window and you can put your hand up. Go ahead, Samuel. Sorry.
I was gonna ask, is Hegel an atheist?
No. No, he's a Christian. He always went to church, just like every good German.
Okay, because I was gonna say, is he Pentecostal or Catholic?
I'm sorry?
If he's the Pentecostal faith or Catholic, or is he Protestant?
I forget. I don't remember.
No, he was a Protestant.
He's
Typical
Protestant.
North German, yeah.
Oh, in
I
Lutheran.
assume Lutheran, most likely
Yeah,
Lutheran.
I don't think Pentecostal came out of Germany. It was from somewhere around Brussels or something like that. I don't know.
Think of him
So
as
he's
that helps.
Protestant. Huh?
Think of him as Lutheran if that helps.
Huh?
He's Lutheran? Okay. Yeah, so anyway, so Hegel's a Lutheran, but thanks for joining us, Samuel. And what did you want to sort of like compare religions or something?
Yeah, I was just saying, because if he was Christianity Pentecostal, because then that would relate to what I'm saying.
And you
this
were
meeting.
okay. Jesus, got it. Thank you. Yeah. So I think I wanted to bring up David. You're going to put your hand down, right?
Oh, yes, I wanted to ask, well, I'm not sure how to tie the emotion into it because I understand the idea that somewhat this is driven, you can see it as emotion, but to me, I never read it as the primary thing being emotion driving this as much as the attempt for consciousness to see consistency, unity between what it's observing and what it knows it itself is, because consciousness distinguishes itself from something and then it's a relationship to it. And so it knows, we would say, what it's thinking and then what its object is. And it has this conflict. And if there's any disagreement between that experience and this being the thought, there's a reconciliation that has to be, that dissonance, you can call that a discomfort or annoyance or despair to resolve, but it could be just, a rational conflict that we're dealing. So, I see it driven by the need for unity. And maybe that's emotional. But does that take something away from the reading? I didn't get
No.
Okay.
No, I think you're pushing us a bit into the mind of Freud. But that's excellent, David. Yeah.
I didn't know I was reading with a Freudian twist. I didn't know.
Yeah. I think you definitely got a Freudian handle there on it, and that's perfectly okay because apparently everybody else does that to poor dear Hegel. But the idea is like Hegel is like a fount of information about how the mind might actually work, not a kind of like an invented version, but something that is convenient to the issues of thingness, certainty, perception, and it's also modeled. It's based on a naturalistic model, so that's very useful. So Patrick, is this more on the emotions, or are we going to get into the model
sort of it's the
that's
emotion,
presented?
but it's about the despair. You know, that I
Mhm.
kind of see despair as one particular emotion that allows, you know, the subject viewing the object and having the conflict to let go of the subjectivity, you know, and that one then, you know, becomes, you know, one's self becomes the object of whatever one is engaged with, you know.
Right.
And so the emotion kind of allows one to kind of make that final break into that and finding oneself within, you know, the thing that one is contemplating.
Yeah, I think that's right. It creates it could be like a strong step towards creating a freedom to in that section 78 that I read that I alluded to. It's creating this freedom to basically create to basically jump into um, an analysis of what how we actually discover things and how we reify our concepts in a way that allows us to know what is true. So the basically sense certainty, I'm not sure if it's the introduction or sense certainty, but at the beginning of sense certainty in section 107, he gives a methodology for basically understanding the object. The sense certainty section is about recognizing the object as the truth. So this is a major step in epistemology. The object itself is the truth when it presents itself to us. We know it's true. If the object happens to disappear, maybe we're not so sure that it's true. Maybe it's gone now. Like if you're watching a fly, it could fly away. So the object might not always be true, but it's true for us now. If you see a tree, you usually recognize that the tree is true, and it's always going to be true for probably as long as your house is standing. The tree might be true, unless you're planning to cut it down and plant a couple other trees instead. So the thing starts by being the true, and then after it's true, you move into a kind of you move into the triad, which in the case of an object starts with the truth, pointing to the now, and being able to recognize its truth. Then the second thing is to observe that a supersession is occurring, which announces the previous as a has been. This is Hegel's word, has been, negating the now. So you have a tree still, but there's might be a different view of the tree. In other words, you might have, if a tree wasn't that important, you don't necessarily have a second moment, but you have a second moment where you sort of say, well, wait a second, what kind of tree is this? Is this a fig tree or an apple tree? Is this a tree with low branches that I might walk into? Or is it a tree with fairly high branches, which is going to be very convenient to me if I want to walk under it instead of walking around it? So you have a second view, and that second view is going to essentially negate what was true before, because it's a new experience, because you're having a new experience, probably even for a new reason, or maybe something has changed that's caused you to draw your attention back to the object. So like there's a bird in the tree now, or a monkey, and you're more concerned about it now than you were before. And then the third thing that happens is there's a reconstitution of the now. which, in other words, you recognize that you're in a complete moment, that the moment you're in allows for a difference in knowledge, that what you knew before has been enhanced or subtracted. Maybe you've subtracted something from it, but there's a change in your knowledge. And now there's a change in the truth. So there, in a nutshell, is Hegel's theory of sense certainty. He also has some really nifty mind experiments based on the now and on the, which are really worth reading, the now mind experiment and the here mind experiment. And they're extremely, I think those are in the introduction. And they're extremely useful because they help focus on focus us in on the nature of time, the now, and the nature in perception, the nature of time, which what he calls sense certainty, the nature of time and sense certainty, and the nature of the now. The now is similar to Heidegger's explanation of it. There's repeated nows. Any now can sort of stand by itself, but you're always going to have an issue looking at other nows. Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think that, the perception, the first perception you have, and then the second perception is that second perception was always there, because we're part of a totality, we're all the things that are there. So the second perception, one just becomes aware of it. It presses forward. It isn't just that we have a different kind of concept. Oh, now I know it's a fig tree. It's something that's, part of oneself that one wasn't aware of, that kind of comes out and is so different from the first kind of concept that we lose the first concept. And then we kind of retreat back and we kind of codify now, and we gather back kind of like our knownness, what we already thought we were, which, in some ways a retreat, I would think. I mean, that's sort of how I see it.
David, or not David, David S. Yeah.
So now has kind of taken on two senses. At first, there was no awareness of anything engaging that we would call a temporality. It was just the immediacy of the object in sense. And then when we go looking for the truth of that, and we re-examine that as experience, now it's no longer the same experience and truth. And this is a rational problem because the same thing is not the same thing. So re-examining now, and re-examining now, every time it's done with something different happening, a new concept, a new thing arises, a now, a universal, which is the realization that there is a consciousness of a moment in time, the present. So this is the creation of the notion of the present. This is consciousness evolving to now have a self-awareness of temporality. So the now is something that has a truth. It's what's going to be in sense certainty now and now. And now there's a truth to now. Now is true in time and now has truth. So we've established a kind of truth that didn't exist before. This is what has been accomplished only in the object, though, because now we have to look at what has happened to the I. He's trying to do everything at once as he goes through this. That's what I want to point out.
Well, I'm kind of I first I want to address Patrick. It sounds to me that there's a mystical element in what you're saying, and I don't think there's any drive towards mysticism in Hegel. uh, there's a that you said the second perception is already there already. Okay, and I was pointing out that there's a kind of a concern in our mind about what kind of tree we're looking at, perhaps, or there's another separate being in the tree, or call it a property if you like, but it's a tree now. Now it's a tree with a monkey, or it's a tree with butterflies stuck to it everywhere, or cicadas. It's a different tree than we thought, right? So this is the step two. This is where it is a difference. It's a discrimination. Hegel was never mystical. He believed in differences. He believed in change. He believed in and he didn't have any fancy. His words for it weren't that fancy. He used words like sense certainty and immediacy, meaning something has to be there. What he says immediate means that there's no translation. In other words, you have an object, and we don't have to translate our concept of the object because we know there's an object. And even if we don't believe that the object is there, it's still going to be there for us when we look away. So that's his opinion of sense certainty. It's different from a rationalist view. That's how it's different from a rationalist view. And as far as the now is concerned, the now is a real now. In other words, the now is not something that causes our mind to think in terms of. Ellen, you're making noise in the background. If you could mute yourself, please. Yeah, Ellen, there's noise coming from your microphone. Could you? Thank you. Anyway, yeah. So we have in the now we have something which is immediate, but it's not kind of different. In other words, it's something that always creates the possibility of difference. And
You're brilliant.
Well, thank you, Jamila, but I owe it to frankly, I owe it to mainly one person. Yeah. And somebody who's really concentrated on what it was like to think, and concentrated on how to make natural distinctions between things without necessarily having a whole surplus of theory in order to describe it. So that's all. That's just my opinion about now. Is that now is very special. I mean, not now, but time is extremely special, and it does. I'm gonna try to find the Hegelian view, number 77. Oh no, that's not it. Never mind. Yeah, he had a tendency to start his paragraphs off with the word now. So that kind of threw me off. Sorry about that.
Establishing here at this, isn't he also doing some really principle grounding of things in terms of having a spatiality?
No. The spatiality is, for Hegel, is what things have and that we have. So in other words, we have a spatiality and things have a spatiality. And because things have a spatiality, we recognize the spatiality in things, and we're capable of determining basically the whole epistemology of Hegel is like tracking. In other words, we track objects through time and space, and we do this because we have perceptual apparatus. And his example of the here, what I was talking about in the, I'll start with that because that's the one I completely remember without having to look at the page. But the here is like we're looking at a tree, and then we turn around and we look at a house. So when we turn around and we're no longer looking at the tree and we're contemplating a house, or not we're sensing a house in front of us. He warns us not to contemplate things, only sense them. So we're sensing a house, and we're no longer. Ellen, I think you're back at it. I still hear that noise.
I don't have any noise. Let me turn it off.
Huh? It's somebody else? I wonder. Anyway,
Noise. Where it's coming from.
yeah. Okay. Anyway, so the here we're looking at a house here, and we were looking at a tree. So we know that the tree was. We know that the tree is still there, even though we're not looking at it. So in other words, we observe the truth of the tree, and we still have the truth of the tree. So that's his example of the here, and he's pointing out that the here, I call it the there, but the there is always something that's present for us. We always have things in a there. We don't ever observe things outside of the there-ness, and this idea that we can actually revisit things is really important, because the revisiting of things and creating new truths out of our certainty of things is actually a way of progressing in our knowledge. It's how we progress in our knowledge. It's one of the ways, it's the foundational way in which we progress in our knowledge. And then he has other levels outside of that. He has the next level up would be perception, how we discriminate the properties of things and how the properties are processed in the mind. Go ahead, Stephen. You're next.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about Kant's views on history now. Oh, sorry, Hegel's views on history. Now, it's been developing in the 18th century, the concept of a progressive history. You'd probably say prior to that, the idea of progress seemed to be more of a mythical kind, but the scientific concept of historical progress was just starting to show up around the time that Hegel was born. Now, he's a full-blown historical progress. And I just noticed, according to the lecture notes, he divided the old world up into three. So you had the Orient, where civilization began, but somehow that faded. Now, according to the lecture notes, Hegel was claiming due to a lack of individualism. But then it moved on to the Greco-Roman world, which was the next phase, but they too faded because they didn't have enough individualism. And he suddenly realised that the porridge that was just right was his glorious Protestant world, which is, you know, rising as an edifice above the entire world. So I wonder what you'd have to say on his concepts of historical progress and the slightly chauvinistic tone related to the old world.
The old world, and you were speaking about the old world in the sense of what period?
Oh, the whole history, how history is developed.
How history had prior to Napoleon, let's say. Okay.
Yeah, the great place was, you know, the Middle East, or, you know, China. The Orient is where it first civilization first flowered, and then the barbarian Greeks and Romans were converted, and then became the new grand phase of civilization, and they faded. And finally, his glorious Northern Europeans, who all followed Martin Luther, were now the new force in the world, who had been just purely a pack of barbarian savages a few centuries before. So there's this historical progression.
Right. Yeah, the chauvinism, my opinion, is that the chauvinism was already well established prior to in the 16th and 17th centuries with Luther and so forth. So the chauvinism was already well established, and it was more or less de facto in terms of the Roman Catholic Empire prior to Protestantism. and and then following that, it became part truth that basically the age of empires, the age of the new empires, the Bavarian Empire, the British Empire, not Bavarian, the Prussian Empire, and the British Empire, the Spanish Empire in the New World. All of this Portuguese trade in slaves in Africa. So it just all became prior, right? A century and more prior. So that's all I'm saying. It was well established.
The Habsburgs had been the great power, you know. They must have been terrifying the Protestants. Well, they were literally going into the Protestant countries to smack their bottoms, weren't they?
Right. No, I think it's completely fair to take Hegel, to dismantle the what do you call it, the parts of Hegel that apply to that. In other words, the ideas of the ideas in Hegel that relate, not his bare theory of consciousness, which I really appreciate a lot, but the ideas on the old world and the progression of spirit as if it belongs to Germany. In other words, we have spirit because we're Germans, this idea. There's a spirit of the new world against the old world. I don't know if he uses those terms, old world and new world, but he might say the old and the new.
The flame of civilization is being passed on to the Germans. So he's sort of this idea of spirit.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm not against chauvinism. I don't see chauvinism as bad. I just see chauvinism as chauvinism and look for the results.
Right. Right. Now, the only thing, and once again, it's true, but in those days, if you were German, if you were a German intellectual, you were likely to be chauvinist. In other words, Kant, we'd had Leibniz and Kant and who's the other guy? I forget, but just this long sequence of German philosophers and German invention was going on. The society was was progressing. It wasn't the greatest author in the world was
I would make this point. I think Kant might be on to something as regards historical progression.
Yeah.
And it's not just purely chauvinism, but I mean, I've had this mental exercise. Go back to 1000 AD. Mm-hmm. You're a spirit hovering in space and there's a God next to you saying, now look at the earth. Who are going to be the big powerful people in 1,000 years' times? And you'd look at China and you'd go, oh, magnificent. You'd look at India. Oh, they're going to be the greatest. You'd look at the Middle East. They're pretty good. And then you'd look at the Europeans, especially the lot clustered around the English Channel. And you'd say, what a pack of pig farmers. And the spirit says, oh, they're going to be masters of the world in 1,000 years. Would you like to take a bet on it? It's freaky. You've got to look at around the English Channel. Their only exportable commodity is mud. How the hell did they get where they are?
I take that personally, Stephen. I grew up on a pig farm. Anyway, yeah, that was great. Now that's good contribution, because we had this national chauvinism, which was endemic to Germany, that grew in the 19th century. It was more pronounced probably in Fichte. I think Hegel wasn't really stretching his German wings as much as Fichte would later. Fichte would say, Germany has to settle all its disputes through fighting and conquest. In other words, we have to be the dominant country from now on. That was Fichte's opinion in his later in his life.
The German politics ended up being a century behind. They were playing 19th century politics in the 20th century, which created
That's a good point of view. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
What
I read
worked
a
a century before, they were still following.
right. Yeah, it's true. The ideology had developed in the 19th century that German was going to have to become a steel state. Germany would have to participate in European politics by becoming a steeled entity. And maybe the prediction was true. I mean, maybe that was what the destiny of Germany was. In other words, maybe they didn't have a choice, but it wasn't Hegel's idea. Hegel's idea was that in terms of intelligence and in terms of understanding consciousness, I got this right now, here and now. I got this. I'm going to explain how consciousness works, how perception works, how society progresses, and what are the forces in society that bind it together and allow for individuality and individual freedom and individual creativity. I got this. So we're gonna, we'll just and it's gonna emanate from here, and this is a good place for it to emanate from. So as good a place as any. I don't think he was that nationalistic, but he did have this view of the old and the new, and that view came from what was happening in Europe. You had the conquest of Napoleon. When he wrote this in 1906. I mean, 1806. So he wrote this in 1806, and Napoleon had just like rode through town, literally. So that was kind of like it's kind of like holy smokes! You wouldn't believe how organized these guys are. They figured out just how to unite the society. We're going to have a new unity, and everything is contributing to the new universal of spirit. So that was the way Hegel saw history. He saw history as just like in the natural world, you have a realization of humanity. You have a realization of higher beings and lower beings from lower beings. Which was a common idea among the intellectuals then. They already knew about evolution. They just didn't have the theory of natural selection. So the idea is that the idea that that there was going to be a development was not unique to Hegel. That the society was going to develop. That it had been developing. It was going to continue to develop. And it was developing in Germany like it was developing nowhere else. In other words, there was no other civilization that could match the pace of development that was occurring at that moment in Germany. But of course, that was like a loaded point because Germany had a larger population and probably more resources than some of these other countries did. David.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly in no position to interpret historical implications of Hegelian philosophy. Looking at this chapter and wondering in what sense it informs where you're going with the conversation, or if we're more going to be focused on sensitivity. Because this is, as a phenomenology, it's talking about what constitutes truth. So in a certain relationship to objects and things, we are in a pre-perceptual relationship. We're in a sensing relationship. We're not in a necessarily knowledgeable, confirming, knowledge relationship of concepts. We're in a sense relationship, and there's a truth to that. And the thing that's worth calling a truth is laid out in very basic terms because you only have a very fundamental relationship to what you're trying to resolve as the object and your representation of it, your knowledge of it. So making the knowledge and the object coincide seems to be the goal of this chapter, to describe that process. There are no other consciousnesses entailed in this process. There's no other spirit of the times. There's no cultural milieu. It doesn't come up. So I'm not sure, does this chapter inform the rest of that, or does that inform this?
No,
Or-
I don't think
No.
we've been discussing that. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was what I'm asking. That's all.
Oh, it's like it is a digression to the rest of the book. But even if you've listened to the lectures by Matt, he's doing that. He's talking about religion. He's talking about nationality. He's talking about the progression of spirit. So I thought it was good to sort of like just bring it up because it's like it's kind of the hardest part, especially if you're already something like a Marx point of view and it's not compatible. It could be difficult to sort of like accept Hegel's point of view about the progression of spirit, in terms of its own historicity. In other words, if we buy into, like if you bought into this whole post World War II idea that the world is composited of happy states because they're democratic and because the states have realized democracy, they become happy and they become free and essentially ready to. They become states that are ready to develop, ready to cooperate with each other, ready for peace, so to speak. Although that didn't happen. But that's the idea of post World War II Western ideology.
Is that a Hegelian?
Not Hegelian. No, it does. I would say it doesn't go along with Hegelian concept at all. So, in other words, if you believe these various ideologies of history, they might clash. Just that one clashes, just like Marxism clashes. In other words, the Marxism idea that society has to become unstable because of the capitalist system, and the capitalist system will force the society into instability, and then the instability will be rescued by a cadre of leaders, or a after. For Marx, it was more of the proletariat. There was going to be an uprising, and the uprising would result in an elimination of competition between classes because of a new dominance. The proletariat would become newly dominant over the previous ruling classes. So this is like different. This is very separate from Hegel. Very different sort of concept about spirit. So I don't want to go in any more into spirit. But Hegel believed that because history was a progression of spirit, that things were going to continue to get better in several areas, not just in consciousness, not just in the field of rationality. Things would get better in religion, things would get better in politics. You would have better rulers. Not that the old rulers were bad. He loved the old rulers. If you ever read the Philosophy of History by Hegel. But the old rulers were the new rulers would be the new rulers of the new enlightened society. They would be even better. So you ain't seen nothing yet could be characterized as the Hegelian view of history, or the Hegelian view of the rising spirit through history. So. We'll leave that alone and return back to sense certainty, because that's what we were discussing. So, and I was just looking for a good paragraph to read, but I'll just settle on one. Number 95. So that's where he talks about the this and the twofold shape of its being, and the now and the here. So I'll just hit that real quick. It is then sense certainty itself that must be asked, what is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape of its being, oh, by the way, being is a really important word for Hegel. Being is like the essence of objects. In other words, if things are in the world, if you detect things, they have a being. So that's what being means to Hegel. So in the twofold, we're looking at the twofold shape of its being as now and as here. So they were the two the two parts of the shape of being. The dialect has in it will receive a form as intelligible as the this itself is. So in other words, the dialectic in here becomes as intelligible as the this is. To the question, what is now? Let us answer. E.g., now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment will suffice. We write down the truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down, any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, we shall have to say that it has become stale. So time does exist already. And as time passes, truth becomes stale. So this is an example of Hegel's genius, is that realizing that the truth, and it goes on, but the idea is that in time, you have a difference between noon and nighttime. There's a really serious difference. And some things seem not to exist at night because it might be too dark, it might be a new moon and it's just like too dark to see anything, or a dark house. And you have, so sense certainty in the sense that you're sensing it now, that tends to go away. You're not as certain as many things as you were before. You had the ideas about many things before. Mm-hmm. Now you have ideas about few things because it's nighttime. And so and even just like if you do something in the morning, at noon, it might already be stale. Like you might have a bucket full of milk, but it's starting to curdle by noon. Or people have taken a drink out of it and it's starting to diminish. So a lot of things can happen because of time. And it's just that's just an example of how he relates to time as a necessary part of existence, not as any mystical quality or anything that's immeasurable. If you want to measure it, he talks about that. He says, yeah, we out of the noon, we get hours. After that, after hours, we can have minutes and so on and so forth. So you don't have to be shy about the fact that existence is divided up into times, and that objects have a there-ness. They have a spatiality, in other words. I'll go on. Yeah, so that's the essence of his theory of knowledge. You know, it's that you pick things out. Is there anybody that doesn't want me to go into perception? Because that's the next chapter. If no one's, we can go into that later, perhaps, if somebody wants to. I got a hand, Garth. Yeah.
Oh yeah, if you don't mind, I wanted to make a few comments on Hegel's general method. So if you read the preface, he says a lot about philosophy at his time, but he also lays out some of his sort of goals and his way of thinking. One of the things he says is that the truth is the whole, like the entire thing is the truth. And then the falsity, the negative, is actually just like conditions the truth. It doesn't destroy the truth. We might think of like false as destroying truth, but for Hegel, it like reveals the truth of the truth, so to speak, right? Like it makes the truth even more true in a sense. And so this is sort of the way he develops like his whole thing. And I forgot my second point. I guess I'll stop then.
I like that. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Jamelia.
For example, living life is the having memory makes life more true.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Because you
memory
don't
is
forget what's
qualified.
true.
Yeah.
You don't forget what you know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. So and forgetting is like a negation. So that's an example of a negation. If you forget something, it's like that knowledge is getting negated in that sense. And it's a conditioning. I was just going to comment on what you said, Garth, to the extent that, that what you're saying is exactly right. It's a conditioning, but the conditioning can result in a difference. It can result in a canceling at the worst case. That's the extreme case. It's a canceling. It's usually some kind of a difference. He points out a difference that results from a negation. So and a negation is can just be simply what we attribute to. Oh, gee, I didn't notice that it was a tree, that it was a monkey, the tree full of monkeys. It's a I thought it was just a fruit tree. And obviously maybe it is a fruit tree, but the idea is that the perception begins to change, and the 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 negation begins to occur. In other words, something that was just sort of like good and welcome becomes an issue in a different way. And so the negation contributes to a gathering of information, new information, and the new information can represent a difference, or it can represent a change in time. In other words, the tree, it's autumn, and the tree is losing its leaves. The pile of leaves is getting deeper and thicker, and there's a kind of a change in time that's occurring to the object that I thought I understood the truth about, a green tree, but the tree is beginning to no longer be green, and eventually it will no longer have any leaves at all. So the negation is a very important concept in Hegel because it forces us to constantly revise our knowledge and what we consider to be the truth of the matter.
do you mind if I jump in and
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, you made a good point about canceling. Yeah, and I'm thinking, man, does that sort of contradict what I just said? And I think for the most part, yes. But I think when this kind of thing happens, it's sort of a radical moment when the canceling happens, because then consciousness has experience or a moment of learning, and it decides to try something new, like when canceling happens, because it means it really got stopped in what it was doing. And I remember my second point now, which is Hegel talks from 2 points of view. And when you're reading, you have to be really careful when he switches from one to another. Sometimes he says consciousness, reason, or self-consciousness, or the person or something, the individual. Then he's talking from through the eyes of this learning spirit, this learning soul that's developing. But he also sometimes says we, or the philosopher, and then he means us readers observing what's happening to him or her or it from outside, and sort of saying, oh, this is totally different, it thinks one thing is happening, but something else is happening. And that when you think that you've read something that is completely contradictory to what Hegel just says, check for that switch over, because I think when I realized when he was doing that, that was when the book really started to click for me, and I started to get a lot more out of it.
Okay, I like that. The text is complex. There's no question about that. He uses the word "our." I like it when he uses the word "our," because he's talking about humans. He's talking about thinkers, people with consciousness.
You're a thinker.
Well, thank you, Jamelia. You are a thinker too. So this the thought is basically what is coming. Is what is at issue. For Hegel, the being is always the truth, or the this. He calls it the this. When he's first explaining it, he doesn't talk about the being as much. He switches gears because he escalates, so that this eventually becomes the being. And the being, to me, as an as a not an but I mean as a computer programmer, it's very easy for me to understand the being as the essence. So in other words, inside any object, you have the essence of what it is. Later on, he says in the perception chapter, he says that the essence is the properties. The properties are the essence. But it can also be looked at as the object being a being itself. So in other words, the object, and the other thing he says a lot to change the mood, Garth, because this is what I think you're referring to, is another thing he does to change the mood, the intellectual mood, is to introduce the word universal. So thank you. So that's cool. I was wondering how the reactions actually worked. Now I get it. So the universal is the changing of the understanding what in the object is going to kind of remain. What remains. So it's what remains is what is most important to us, and what remains is the changed object once we have made it part of a universal. So, and this is a new use. If you've been reading Kant for 6 weeks, like some of us have, this is a new use of the word universal. It's the idea that objects themselves are entities in the real world are universals. You're a universal Jamelia. You're a universal David S. You're a universal Garth, and everyone else. It's the universal is a very fine distinction of what we what an entity means to our consciousness. So it's Hegel's distinction of the entity in consciousness once it's fully mature and stable. In other words, we understand that it's a fig tree in front of our house. Some other day we're going to look out the window and think about what kind of tree, think about the tree and measure its growth and so forth. Or if it happens to fall all over the driveway like my tree did a couple times.
So would that tree be a reference to the tree of knowledge?
No, I wasn't going there, Jamelia, but thanks. David.
That's in self-certainty. Actually, first I want to agree with Garth that the method is explicitly laid out, I think in the introduction, where he says, you must go through these sequential steps. And as you do, we're going to do it from the point of view of consciousness. And I'm going to describe it from our universal, our knowledge, like you said. And he uses the we when he's letting you in that we're the group watching consciousness. And then he completely describes the process from
Perfect.
the ground you're at, the conscious level, the self-sense, the sense certainty level. So you get two descriptions at least of the same process. And usually the process itself already has moments that are separate, that you have to go to each moment and experience in order to understand, well, why aren't we done? Isn't this total absolute knowledge? No, because there are conflicts. I look out the window again, I look out the window again. Why am I not certain every time with the same certainty? So, and he does describe in this chapter right off the bat what a universal is. A universal is a not this, that with equal indifference, I mean, it could care less as well. It's a this or not this, right? It's something which is neither this nor that. An entity of this sort is by and through negation. So it's perfectly cool with referring to all the things that, would belong, within it, a universal. So that's usually part of solving a problem when you have differences, because differences are your cognitive dissonance. And that means you don't have an understanding and knowledge at the level, you're striving for. There's still a dissonance. And until you can see why dissonance is part of what you're supposed to be getting, you're uncomfortable with the dissonance. Although I wouldn't call it uncomfortable, I would say you're not, you haven't reached unity yet, which is what he's striving for. Knowledge is this kind of,
Right.
Absolute is unified.
Yeah, I was using the word stable, but that's a better word. That's more Hegelian. The point of reaching unity, of the object reaching unity with itself and consistency with itself. The I'm going to read real quick, and thanks for pointing out the methodology and sense certainty. I'm going to read that paragraph, which is long but not too long. Okay. But the idea that I see, the thing I really like about Hegel, more than any other single thing, is that he's never dogmatic. In other words, he's showing us a method of discernment of objects that without recourse to any dogmatism. In other words, you can take this or leave it, or you can go on to the next paragraph, or in other words, I'm just simply showing you something. And there's never any kind of like, understand this well, note bene, or anything like that. It's kind of like there is a kind of like a pointing out of things, and this is what happens, and let's see if you agree with this, or if you're just going to pass this book on to somebody else and don't worry about it. So
that's why I'm always so freaked out with the discussions like you were having. He is such an authority. He has this point of view of history. That doesn't sound like what we read here. It really doesn't, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. When he's talking about sense certainty, he's just basically presenting a kind of an act. He's basically presenting the act of intuition from a very special point of view, that the intuition is as an accomplishment of consciousness in cooperation
Correct.
with something real, with something which is a thing, and it's a respect. In other words, we in perception, or in sense certainty, we develop respect for the thing that we're gaining knowledge of. So I'll go ahead and read real quick. In this pointing out, number 107, in this pointing out, then, we see merely a movement. We see a movement which takes the following course. 1, I point out the now, and it is asserted to be the truth. I point it out, however, as something that has been, or as something, because nows are always changing. One is always coming after the other. Something that has been, or as something that has been superseded. I set aside the first truth. So it's not negated fully in this sense, but it's set aside. So the language has changed. Number 2, I now assert as the second truth that it has been, that it is superseded. So in other words, there's a second truth now. There's the first truth is the object, which is a has been, and the second truth is that the object is now superseded. Then third, but what has been is not. There's the negation. I set aside the second truth, its having been, its supersession, and thereby negate the negations. So the second truth, the has been, the recognition of the hasness of the object is what is negated. I set aside the second truth, its having been, its supersession, and thereby negate the negation of the now, and thus return to the first assertion that the now is. So the now still applies. In other words, it's just like when you're saying now, 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 now. And that example is from Heidegger, by the way. So like Heidegger is a Hegelian, but I didn't know. And and certainly Patrick did, yeah, since he was the first to bring it up. The now and pointing out the now are thus so constituted that neither the one nor the other is something immediate and simple, but a movement which contains various movements, a movement which contains various movements, which I think David was talking about. This is posited, but it is rather an other that is posited, or the this is superseded. And he's kind of like repeating himself a little bit. And this otherness,
Where
or
can
the
I
setting
find
aside of the first, well, the book is called Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit.
Or
And it's
mind?
the translation. It's the, no, well, I like this book. I like this translation a lot. This is the translation by A.V. Miller. And it contains analysis by J.N. Findley. So it's the Phenomenology of Spirit, published by somebody. Can't read it. Oxford paperbacks.
So you've got
It's
some
the
notes.
Oxford edition. Huh?
You've got some
Yeah.
notes.
So it's worth it. It's a good buy. No, I'm looking at the book. I'm just reading you the front cover of the book. Anyway, so it's it has notes in it at the end of the book. In case nobody realized, Findlay actually has his notes, and this is cool because I keep notes too. And the way he keeps notes is the way I keep notes. He keeps notes on each chapter, on each paragraph, and I have those notes there the same way for each paragraph or section of paragraphs. So I've been keeping notes very much in the same way. So I feel really cool about that. You know, that he does kind of the same thing that I do. Just basically trying to track what I'm learning from reading it. But anyway, I talked about the otherness. So the supersession, and this otherness, still halfway through the paragraph, or the setting aside of the first, is itself in turn set aside, and so has returned into the first. Now that's difficult to understand, but when Hegel talks about the return, he's always saying that there's something that's more important here. So when you return from the setting aside and the object of the negation of the negation in the now, he's talking about that's what he means by the reflection. The self is the thing is reflected again into itself, and it's a simple entity which in its otherness remains what it is. So he's talking about how a thing changes back into itself through a step which can be called a negation, because there's a negation of the sense that the thing is a has-been. So that concept of has-been is what has to be negated here in sense certainty. So it's a single entity which in its otherness remains what it is, a now which is an absolute plurality of nows. So now instead of a now, you have a plurality of now, which is kind of in a Kantian sense, kind of a wonderful thing. But we won't talk about Kant anymore, I hope. And this is the genuine now. The now as a simple day, which contains within it many nows, hours. A now of this sort, an hour, similarly in many minutes. And this now in likewise many nows, and so on. The pointing out of the now is thus itself the movement which expresses what the now is in truth, viz, a result or a plurality of nows, all taken together. And the pointing out in the experience of learning that now is a universal.
Mm-hmm.
Time itself, universal. And the now is a universal movement in the existence of anything. Not that the thing can't once again become a has-been and the cycle becomes repeated, but Hegel has done his best to, inside a paragraph, explain to us what the cycle inside of a plurality of DAOs represents. Patrick.
It reminds you of Heidegger in the whatever metaphysics is. I forget what the title of it is. But,
Introduction to Metaphysics?
Yes, Introduction to Metaphysics. Yeah, where then, he talks about the nothing, that being is comes out of nothing and has to go into nothing. So I kind of think of that as sort of the negation is into what nothing is, and nothing is sort of the totality of all being, that being kind of comes out of the nothing. So that it reminds me of that.
Nice. David.
Yeah, the paragraph you were reading, which was the method of this whole book applied to the one form,
Object.
which
Yeah.
is uncertainty, it begins in thus pointing out the now we see. So it was Garth's point that this is a narration from the omniscient observer's point of view of what consciousness was going through. So we read it authentically or phenomenologically, remembering that there is only the barest experience present in self-certainty, which this is describing at that very bare level. And that's what we're trying to understand. What can happen at the level of immediacy? You can have the immediate and the immediate not being there. You have the realization, the ability to reflect is the only thing he seems to use as a capability here. Reflecting on the immediacy not being is the new thing. You have a negation of presence. The negation of presence allows for this new thing, the now, because that's you. That's consciousness. That's not things. The now is consciousness having a presence. It hasn't realized that. We're not going to know that for a while. We know all these things. But for consciousness, all it knows is there's an immediacy, and there are things that aren't in that immediacy. It's learned that there's a negation of immediacy, which was the only thing sense originally had. Now it has a now of its own, which doesn't contain things. So there's an is not to being. There's being just normally is at the level of sense certainty, but now there's an is not, because now is here. It's like he's given us a lot of new stuff by going through this, but only we can see this.
I think you're.
Yeah, you don't think, because that's his notion of being at the immediate level is just being or not being. But now this is putting it together into consciousness having a now is a unity of all these presences, and the not presence are not there. And there's that capability, but the now is part of consciousness, not part of objects. Now, that means we're not unified. We're not at absolute knowledge. There's lots to sew up.
Well, I disagree with you. He has several comments about now belonging to the object itself, and there's not this kind of like now that we have to learn first, and then we can understand things for what they are. Because we've mastered the now. The now just exists. It's the reason we know that the now exists is because the sun goes up and then the sun comes down, and and every day has a night that corresponds with it. There's no absence of now in Hegel. The now is always present. And it's a prerequisite to being able to understand negation. In other words, before there can be negation, there has to be a now, and before there can be a change. Roger's you're putting up your hand, Roger. I think so. I'll let you speak in a minute. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of like assert that the now has to come first. There can't be a realization that of change or any kind of change, whether day and night. All of that has to occur first.
Well, I'll let Roger answer, but the beginning of this chapter was the knowledge at the start is immediately our object. And then at the end of this paragraph you're reading, we have now experiencing, we're experiencing, which means we have something new developed, I think, that now is a universal. So that seems like an addition to what we had before.
Can you point to the exact place you're referring to?
At the end of the paragraph, well, there was the first line of sense certainty, and then the end of the paragraph, you were saying, the plurality of nows in the last sentence.
The paragraph I was reading?
Yeah, the last sentence said, in my translation goes, and the pointing out is the way of getting to know, of experiencing, and he's defined experiencing as the developed consciousness at this point, right? That now is a universal. So I think we've gotten to know that now is a universal, which is like a revelation.
Which paragraph was I reading?
Oh, it was the method.
Was I reading 95? 95? No.
It's pointing out the nows is where you started.
100?
I think it's 107.
All right, which one?
Gee, I don't
107. Okay. Yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So now is the truth, right? But this is in the instance. So the now, which is the third stage now, the new truth. So the now is what the pointing out of the now is a movement which expresses what the now is in truth. So now we know what the now is in truth from Hegel. And it's the result of a plurality of nows all taken together. And the pointing out, so we realize it's a plurality, and the pointing out, or Hegel does at least, and he's helping us out. And the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal. In other words, now is always there, now is always occurring, it never stops, now is always now is a universal in itself because it's always present and it's always occurring. And it's not something that we have to, in other words, we don't have to locate the origin of now inside the mind or we can already see where it is in nature. We can already see the nows in nature. The nows there's nothing there for me that doesn't say that now is de facto. That now is always present, even though it may be universal, but that doesn't hide it from us. It's always known to us. Roger was going to speak.
We got to know is all. I'm just pointing out that sentence says, now we know what now is. We know now is universal. That's the new knowledge, I thought.
Oh, we have the experience of, and then my translation says, the pointing out of experience of learning. Okay, and the pointing out of the experience of learning. Okay, wait a second. This is not a correct use of the semicolon. I've got to use the whole sentence. The pointing out of the now would be the pointing out. Pointing out is the pointing out of the now, right? So the pointing out of the now is the experience of learning that now is a universal, not that now exists, or not that time exists, or how time works, because we already know how time works. We don't need Hegel to understand how time works. So that's where I disagree with you. We don't need Hegel for that. What we need Hegel for is to understand that time is really a universal and it works in our sense certainty. It's crucial to our sense certainty. Roger.
Well, thank you. This has been really helpful. Trying to get clear on exactly what's happening in this chapter on sense certainty. I think back to like a philosopher like Hume, who and maybe all the empiricists use the senses as the fundamental on which everything else is built. The building blocks of sense experience are what leads to concepts and of the most arcane and difficult sort. What I see Hegel doing here, I guess, I don't know a lot about Hegel, but I do know that there is this developmental, this projection toward the absolute, whatever the absolute, whether it's God or whatever it is. So what he's got to do here in this first chapter is both tell us why sense experience or sense certainty is inadequate for reaching the absolute. I mean, it may be a stepping stone to reaching God or the absolute, but it is not, although maybe fundamental, it is not enough. And so he's got to find arguments to show why sense certainty is inadequate. And we have to remember what senses are, what the senses are. I mean, we're talking about sight, taste, smell, very fundamental things that even a little child, a baby, without language, has the capacity for. A baby can sense what we sense when we see red, but it has no language to describe it. It doesn't have the concept of red, but it sees red. And in that sense, a baby, you cannot challenge the experience of a baby. And that's what he means, I think, by sense certainty. Now, this talk about time, James, I think it's a way of challenging the fundamental of sense certainty as being like, oh, this magnificent thing that Hume starts with and always appeals to, or that Locke or Berkeley, go back to. It's not enough, just like a baby's experience is not enough, because the baby doesn't have the conceptual apparatus that comes maybe in the next chapter with on perception, where we get this, we get language, we get judgments being made. There's none of that in this chapter. So what's wrong with sense experience is that the sense of time, we don't sense time. Not like we sense the color red or taste something sour, you see, or smell something like, say, you smell something foul. We don't, time's in another dimension. And it's certainly part of our experience, but it's not something sensed. I think Kant pointed that out, didn't he? In the Transcendental Aesthetic, that time and space are kind of like, they're not categories, but they're not things sensed in intuition. We apply them to intuition and sense experience, but that's why we got to go beyond sense certainty, precisely because time and space are something extra that get applied to sense experience, but they themselves are not sensed the way tastes and smells and sights are. That's why, James, I think it's wrong for you started out by talking about trees. We see trees and we see monkeys and we see butterflies, but you see, those require language, they require concepts. And in this chapter, we don't see butterflies, trees, and monkeys. We see colors, a phantasma, a kind of a kaleidoscope of colors. And we're certain about them Hegel would say, hey, yeah, you're absolutely right. No one can question your capacity to see colors and distinguish between, say, blue and red. But that's not enough to reach the absolute. That's just the stuff we're going to work with, I guess. I mean, that's my take on it, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds to me like you're bringing a bit of a Humean perspective on your reading of Hegel. Not that it's wrong. I'm just saying Hegel has a certain opinion of the skeptics. He calls the Hume, those guys, skeptics, and he has a much nastier opinion than you might imagine of them. The for Hegel, the need for skepticism is erased. He wants to instill certainty here. In other words, not that I think you started out by saying that we're not going to have we're not going to have the possibility of the absolute because certainty is not possible with the senses. But that's not what Hegel says. What Hegel says is that certainty is completely possible. And that, as a matter of fact, there's a dance between the observer and the object that has to occur. And the dance establishes certainty. And in the sense of believing that an object in there believing that an object is actually there, our senses are absolute, or I mean, our certainty is absolute. When we say there's a tree, we're absolutely sure of it. We're not going to want to debate it with anyone because we are absolutely certain, and we have all the data already that the tree is there. So this question of skepticism that was introduced by the philosophers you were mentioning is not present in Hegel. He goes on in a chapter about perception to talk about specifically the colors and the tastes and the smells and the things that are particular to things that are particular to things that are things that are particular to thingness that we appreciate through our senses. So when we appreciate these phenomena, or what he calls them properties, when we appreciate the properties of things, they tend to compete. There tends to be a lot of them. So like, for instance, if you have an apple and it might be partly red and partly green, so there's competition. There's also the taste. If you taste something, it might taste delicious and look awful, or vice versa. So you have competing properties, and these properties, the competition of properties is a factor in perception, which he's willing to separate from sense, from basic sense certainty, but it's also dependent on the senses. So it's in the region that you're talking about, Roger. You're right to bring it up, but for the Hegel, the properties of objects are in constant competition with our senses. Go ahead, David.
Yeah,
Come on now, I'm first. I've been here for a while with my hand up.
I'm sorry, Patrick. I'm sorry I
you.
missed you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Oh, back to the thing about now. I think that it's about time, and that we have one thought, and then some other kind of new thought comes. Well, there's something in between there. It's like when we breathe in, we breathe out, but we breathe in, and then there's a space, and then we breathe out, and that space is the negation, and that negation is death, so it's like the now is not just the now, it's the now that's there, that death, a total negation of all things is there as well. And that's what now is. Now is that there's a now, and then there is nothing. and then there's another now. You know, that's how I see it.
Well, it's good. That's good food for thought. Did you have anything to counter with Roger right now?
Well, I'm not. I don't know. It's Hegel is really hard, and I'm really not even sure that I have a very good grasp. Although this is very helpful to get
Thank you.
different people's spin on how to read this guy.
Yeah.
But I do think that although I agree that I'm sure Hegel does not like the empiricists, but I think he respects them in that, he does grant that there is something inviolable about and very basic about sense experience, and that we do, in a sense, like Hume says, we build, those are our building blocks that we use to build concepts. But I think he also says that it's not enough. That's why he starts the book with sense certainty and then moves on to something that's more highly developed, perception, and then to consciousness, and finally to self-consciousness, and on until he reaches the last paragraph. The last section on absolute knowledge.
Okay, I think
what you're saying is really right. I want to specifically talk to what you were saying before, but this just to continue what you're pointing out, that, and this fits into any epistemology. There are sensations. I mean, you have to begin somewhere, and this is like, it's natural to go there. When you look at applying this to any kind of acquired knowledge, like you're looking out through a telescope and you draw every day what you perceive in that telescope. So I believe Galileo drew, pictures of Jupiter over and over and over and over. And that's how he realized that these spots were not all staying in the same configuration. Initially, all he had was what you would call sense or data, sensation or received data in his equipment, in his eyes, and he recorded it and he wrote it down. That's at the level of sense understanding. Those recordings were true. Those were true, accurate. Hopefully there weren't specks on his, goggles while he was looking, right? But he was cleaning off his telescope. He had sense data, detection, nearly anything. Some undetermined objects were detected. This was not perception. But he perceived that these must be spheres like he was standing on. There must be little spheres going around a big sphere. This is the level of perception. His level, he didn't have understanding because he didn't understand gravity. He didn't know, but these really are sensible. He was sure he perceived something now. What he didn't realize is when he carefully drew these drawings, he drew, I don't remember if it was Neptune or Pluto. I think he actually put Pluto on one of his, because he was drawing accurately what he saw, reflecting light. He did not perceive Pluto, but he had sense data that later on turned out to be Pluto. Like he had sense certainty without the perception, without the understanding, without our knowledge. These are really valuable ways to describe what's true about each thing in a different way. I think it's a brilliant way to handle things.
David, that's a fascinating example.
Okay, so hold on, Stephen.
Thank
Let's
you.
get this argument finished. Yeah.
That's it.
Okay, I'm sorry, missed what you said, Roger. That's why I kind of jumped in.
No, I was just commending David for that's a really pregnant example that Galileo, the distinction between what he's sensing through the telescope and then the conclusions, the judgments he draws from it, which will probably, we'll find that kind of thing in the next chapter on perception. I guess. I don't know. I haven't read it yet.
For hundreds of years, there's no Pluto. Not until some later time did they realize there were more planets, like undetected. And just like what we're finding bosons, who knows what else we've detected, right? Okay.
That's right. I think
maybe it wasn't Pluto. Go ahead. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I think that the
Put your hand down, David.
With Hume is helpful. And it's interesting that Hegel starts with something at all. I mean, why not start with nirvana and go the other way? So he's starting with this foundational moment. Hume wants to use it as an anatomy, and he commits to a truncated investigation. He says, let's say that our acquisition is only these sense data. Go. Using just reason, go. And then you're like, oh shit, if you start with sense data, you end with sense data. And so Hegel, Bob Solomon taught a Hegel class, and he would talk about this drive for satisfaction, and he meant it in this Rolling Stones sense. And so when Hegel brings up the Humean beginning, even if you try to withhold, even when the epistemic subject is trying to commit itself to the parameters of the thought experiment, which is these are only sensations, go, it nonetheless finds itself like against its own wishes, getting the whatness of things, which means positioning it on a background of quality. So if you have a black screen and then there's a red blob, you can't help but get the whatness of the red that makes it not the black. You just can't stop yourself. So the subject is supplying this background continuum of otherness for the red and positioning the red and getting the whatness. Every whatness it gets is actually, because it provides this negative background for positioning, it's the self, and it goes to the next stage, and it tries to commit itself to its truncated description of that stage, but it can't help itself. So this is the story of a drive. This is a story of a drive for satisfaction that is always committing violence on its commitment to its first description, and then involuntarily moving it towards higher and higher satisfaction. But they both begin from the same point. Hume begins with it and says, let's do anatomy. Hegel begins with it and says, let's do evolution, and it just takes off.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good contribution, Scott. It sort of brings the notion of the notion of what Hume was trying to do together with Hegel's conception of perception, which is a kind of like a constant conflict and eliminating of deficient properties in favor of specific properties, which will constitute, which can join in a new unity with the body being observed. So just again, Roger, you know, and it applies a little bit to David too, because he said, you know, yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, it is this separating of the object that is new in Hegel. In other words, he's not saying that it's deficient. He's not saying that we're not going to be able to do this. That was Hume that said that. Hegel completely eliminates that argument and attacks Hume's philosophy for being superficial. So the idea, he probably incorporates some very good ideas, but one of the ideas that he does not incorporate from Hume is that certainty is not certainty, or that it's not enough to be an observer. That being an observer is in itself a deficiency and imperfect, and requires some higher level of society, or a higher level of society or a higher level of existence in order to make it right. He thinks consciousness is good enough for certainty, and that's what the chapter is about. If you can cite something in the chapter that says what you're saying, I'll be glad to follow it. I just have to object, you know, that's not what he says, that's what Hume said. Stephen, did you have your hand up?
Oh no, it's just a bit. I thought David was saying Galileo discovered Pluto or something like that.
I think that's wrong. It's something else, but yeah, maybe he can refer to the book title, and we can all go read it. Yeah.
Well, Uranus was discovered in Hegel's Boyhood, so that would have created a lot of excitements. And then Neptune about 1830, Pluto, I think it was about 1930.
It's Neptune.
Yeah. Neptune?
It was Neptune, which wasn't recognized as a planet for 250 years after that. Everyone thought it was a fixed star.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, Scott.
What? Oh, sorry. I'll take my hand down.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so we're just free now. So do you want to go into some of the what Hegel says about perception? Anyone? Okay. Well, the thing I like about perception, he did talk about the importance of the properties, what is perceived. And I had a hard time when I started reading it. I couldn't figure out what the difference. I think this is like my third reading, and I, like I said, I read it when I was very young, and hot-headed radical, and during this reading, I was kind of like reading it again, and I think the other readings too, and you're reading the perception chapter, and you're thinking, God, this is just like the sense certainty chapter. What's the difference? Why are we talking about the same stuff again? Well, he's talking about something different. He's talking about how we perceive the properties of objects. So that's what's kind of hard to get, is that the subject of the matter is what has changed and what perception means. When he talks about perception, he's talking about the ability for our ability to discriminate individual properties of the senses, like sight, smell, taste, and hearing, and so forth, touch, all that. So, and that the universal, the object, which he calls the universal, is always mediated. It's always a mediated universal, and the object must express this this nature in its own self. So the object is a expression of the universal to us, and but he says that the sense knowledge, the wealth of this is in section 112. The wealth of sense knowledge belongs to perception, not to immediate certainty, which has already been established. So we already know how immediate certainty works, and how the this becomes immediate to us, partly because of the universality of the now. So it was only the source of instances, not just from the cooperation of the senses with our consciousness, and so it's always the source of instances, for only perception contains negation, that is, difference or manifoldness within its own essence. So the perception is just another version of how we are how we use the senses, and the way we use the senses is we begin to derive the properties, which begins in 113. So I'll try to read that sentence. Yeah, okay. It will be the second sentence in 113. Consequently, while he's saying the nothing, the determination that it is not this which gets established as a not this, or as something superseded, is hence not as nothing, but as a determinate nothing, a nothing of a content, the content of the this. Consequently, the sense element is still present, but not in the way it was supposed to be, in the position of immediate certainty, not as the singular item that is meant, but as a universal, or as that will be defined as a property. So in other words, we now have the properties of objects and how the properties tend to intermingle in a very determinate way, sometimes contending, sometimes obliterating the others in their negativity. And and that there's another chat. There's another paragraph here which starts out kind of auspiciously. He says, "This abstract universal medium, which can be called simply thinghood or pure essence, is nothing else than what here and now have proved themselves to be, viz., a simple togetherness of a plurality." So we have a plurality of what's true of a object is there's always a plurality of some plurality. It could be a singular plurality, but there's usually some plurality of properties. But many are, in their determinateness, simple universals themselves. The apple is red. There is redness, and redness is a universal. Tastes good, good tasting is a universal. Fantastic concept. Comments? Okay, I'll continue. He does have a process by which the perception occurs. I hate to skip down to it because all this stuff is good. Yeah, gotta read it. Number 115. The moments of perception. These moments, he talks about prior to that, he's talking about the one and how perceiving the this or the object as a one is very important. Now shifts his language. He's no longer talking about the this. Now he's talking about the one. The sentence right before 115 is, as a one, however, the determinateness is set free from this unity with its opposite and exists in and for itself. So the thing which is perceived, which is different, which has a difference, is a in unity with itself, exists in and for itself. In other words, the consciousness is not necessarily there yet, but the thing definitely is, because we begin to perceive it we continue to perceive it as a unity, even though this property, this competition of properties has occurred. Number 115, in these moments, taken together, the thing as the truth of perception is completed. So far, it is necessary to develop it here. It is an indifferent, passive universality, the also of the many properties, or rather matters in it. So he calls the thing a also. The negation in B, negation equally simply, or the one, which excludes opposite properties. In other words, we know that this is a apple with redness. We've excluded opposite properties from it. And C, the many properties themselves. The apple could have a worm on it. The apple could have spots. The apple, has other attributes. The relation of the first two moments, or negation, as it relates to the indifferent element, and therein expands into a host of differences. The point of singular individuality in the medium of subsistence, radiating forth into plurality. I mean, never has there been a cooler sentence. I mean, if I was going to buy a new car as a sentence, this would be the sentence I would pick to represent my new car. Insofar as these differences belong to the indifferent medium, they are themselves universal. They are related only to themselves and do not affect one another. But insofar as they belong to the negative unity, they are at the same time exclusive of the other properties. And this translator is so good at bringing in these distinctions. He puts that in square brackets of other properties. But they necessarily have this relationship of opposition to properties remote from their also. This, so it's there's the relation of opposition to some other properties that are remote from the also. The sensuous universality, or the immediate unity of being and the negative, is thus a property only when the one and the pure universality are developed from it and differentiated from each other, and when this sensuous universality unites them. It is in this relationship, it is this relation of the universality to the pure essential moments, which at last completes the thing. So in pulling all the competing properties, some of which eclipse the others, there are some of which are opposed to the others, but in creating a whole sensuous thing, we are actually, observing the self-identical in its fullness, and as he says, it completes the thing. So that's the kind of that's his point of view about perception. That's perception actually has a lot to do with the unification of the thing, the unity of the thing, and it's a good example of how Hegel is using categories, how Hegel uses categories in order to explain his meanings. And if you want to sort of like create a relationship between Hegel and Kant, that's probably exactly where it lies, is that Hegel is absolutely willing to use the categories as a stepping stone to understanding the process of conscious perception. He goes on to talk about continuity, dominant properties, how dominant properties yield to subjective consciousness, which in turn produces a new this, and how apprehension is related. Apprehension is understanding the object. I forgot to use that word before. When you pull up an object, it's your apprehension of it. That's the word he uses for it. Perception is the distinguishing of the properties from each other and being able to derive changes in the object itself from that. So it's a great chapter. Anyone?
Yeah, this is
Garth. Garth is next.
Scott's next.
Okay.
Garth.
Yeah, I'll just
Garth?
I don't really have a lot to say on that. I just wanted to point out that like this I think is drawing a lot on like Plato and Aristotle's sort of problematics of parts and wholes. Like, how can this thing be a unity when it has all of these different properties? And it's sort of getting at what it means to be a property of something. Like, it just doesn't, like an apple doesn't just have redness in it. That's like not really an adequate description of how the apple is red, right? Because like you can look at a red apple and you can say, wow, that looks really juicy. That looks really good to eat, and if it's not so red, or if it's, got some brown spots, or if it's green and you say it's not ripe enough, or it's, has worms in it or something, right? So perception is like much richer than sense certainty just tells it is. And just positing the properties isn't really enough. And I think that's what drives this dialectic.
Right. The properties have their own dialectic. That's what's really important in Hegel. Properties have their own dialectic, and they add an also. In the end, they add an also to the universal. So, and he always uses the term "for us." Properties are for us. So, in other words, when we perceive a property, it's basically exposing itself. It's not necessarily perfect in itself. It might be a taste. Like an off taste, or it might be something disagreeable in any sense, or it might not. It just might be something that doesn't chime. But the important thing is that a property is always for us. So it's always something that we are able to, through our senses, identify with with an object. But he's explaining here how the properties compose the object for us. In other words, we're not sure what the composition of the object is until we're fully aware that it is an apple and it is red, and albeit small, whatever, so we're content with the object in itself, and we've added on all the properties that we're comfortable in attributing to it, and that's an important process in consciousness, as well as being certain of the object itself. Next is, could you put your hand down, Garth? Next is David.
Right. I like what Garth was saying. This is struggling with the fact that the object is one, and that it's a one at first, a simple one, regardless of the properties that are appearing. And then it's the one that is holding these properties apart from each other, so it's the negative presence of the properties where there are other properties. And so it's an all of the property. So it's a one, but it's an all, which is, but the properties aren't it, but they're part of it. So it's got the whole and the parts problematic in it. I like that. But there's something about consciousness, again, at this stage, becoming aware of its own intrusion as mediating the unity of this. And until that's resolved, there's something that's unstable about this. And I forget how he resolves that problem, because the thing is an all and the thing is a one, and starts out as, simply this one, but it becomes more complicated because the perceptor is getting engaged in this process. And we're going to have to resolve that. Or is that not resolved until force? I mean, is that not resolved in the level of perception?
Yeah, that's where I kind of fail. I mean, I'm doing a very close reading now, but I don't know if he actually finds a defect. I haven't finished this. I'm only a couple pages short. It's only a short chapter anyway. But I don't know if he actually comes to a conclusion. What he does find is that the properties are determinate in the same way that the thing is. So he has a high respect for our perception. But I think what I'm objecting to in general in my reading so far is that Hegel is finding self defects. I don't think he's found a defect in sense certainty. I don't think he notices a defect anywhere in perception. He basically presents these things as facts, building up to, in a triadic manner, he's building up to larger concepts, but he's not kind of like exposing simple concepts in order to prove them wrong later. He's not doing that at all. So if you disagree with those concepts, you should just say it now.
But he does say that you're looking for an absolute, which means it's not going to change. But he's saying the problem with this thing is it finds itself in another. So instead of being a self-sufficient thing, it's no longer self-sufficient. That's his saying this concept is not constructed yet. That's his way of saying it. It finds its own self. It's supposed to be in itself, in another, because it only is a unity because it's reflected in us, what's put together. See, consciousness knows there's a deficiency. I think he's totally pointing out the deficiency.
No. He says he says it's resolved in the dialectic. So in other words, in reality, in the thing itself, there's a dialectic that the properties participate in, and the dialectic the dialectic resolves the imperfection. In other words, the idea of the absolute, you have to leave it. I think you have to leave it alone until he mentions it again. In other words, the absolute is a concept in history. He's very important in his concept of spirit, that there's an absolute spirit. I forget whether he thinks there's such a thing as an absolute consciousness. I'm not sure about that, but I remember when I read it, I hated it. It might be one of those things that I considered a big bump, if there is an absolute consciousness. I think, but I do remember there's an absolute spirit.
The word
And
absolute crops up several times as I'm reading. Is absolute negation, absolute distinctions.
yeah, fine. That's good. Give me an example, because that's true. There could be an absolute negation of something. There could be an absolute. What'd you say? An absolute,
Okay, so there's a paragraph. And
principle.
I can't give you the numbers of paragraphs because I have this goofy translation. But the paragraph begins. I'll tell you if it's near the end. It's about three,
Which one?
4, 5.
Which paragraph?
It begins the necessity of the experience which consciousness has to go through. And it's not your translation, but we're very close.
There's no number there?
That's what I'm telling you.
Well, the numbers, is yours numbered? Do you have numbers on yours?
James.
No numbers.
It doesn't have numbers. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Okay.
You know,
David's book doesn't have numbers.
From 40 years ago, I got this. What is it? It's Lichtheim. And whatever. The necessity of the yeah, I don't know. It's got this cover like this. It's
so go ahead and read it, David. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I apologize.
Don't worry. I'm just trying to make sense of this. The necessity of the experience which consciousness has to go through in finding that the thing is destroyed just by the very characteristic which constitutes its essential nature and its distinctive existence on its own account may, as regards the bare principle it implies, be shortly stated thus. The thing is set up as having a being of its own, as existing for itself, like a thing, perception, or as an absolute negation of all otherness. Hence, it is absolute negation merely relating itself to itself. And then he says here, but this kind of negation is the canceling and superseding of itself, or that means it has essential reality in another. So it's no longer self-sufficient. It has a reality in the other. Guess who the other is? It's us, because we put these things together. So consciousness hasn't pointed to itself yet. I mean, this to me, I'm reading a battle of mental states that are battling with each other. Each one is insufficient until the dialectic, which is this battle.
If he's talking about the properties, he's talking about the property in a battle with another property. So in other words, he says that the properties are constantly or a large number of the properties are in battle with each other. So he's not talking necessarily about the consciousness when he says the other. That's my objection. You're reading stuff into it because you think the other is me.
Well, being later in the chapter, it's about the one and the all being in conflict with each other. Right. How can all of properties and the one at the same time?
Well, so, it's fine. For me, that seems fine. But go ahead, elaborate.
Oh, one and the same thing as the one and all. Yeah. So this being of a different characteristic thing.
Something that needs to emerge from the herd, so to speak.
It has to be both, and that's not a great.
No, it can't be all. It doesn't have to be all. You can have limited properties. Yeah, I think you're sort of like. I think it's okay to have that kind of criticism, but you're making a fine point. You're saying, if you can't have one and all are contradictory to you. And to Hegel, he's making a revision on logic. He is making a revision on logic. He believes that the one and all are not necessarily contradictory. He believes that everything is contradictory, and the one and all explains the principle of force or dominance.
Yeah, but in perception, they can't
Yeah.
exist. They can in understanding. So that's why,
Right.
this has to progress to a level, and that is the resolution. So we've made progress as opposed to just having all
Well,
equal.
right. Some will exist and some won't, but yeah, I get your point. Yeah. Dave, you're the only one with your hand up. Good. Continue talking if you like, David.
No, I'll take it down.
Okay. That was good. I think it's a good point, but I think it's a fine point. In other words, if we want to criticize Hegel's logic, it's going to be tough because he is a logician, and he is going to I think in the end, if you try to attack the logic, he's going to outdo us a little bit. Although I like Garth's, I think he is talking about that idea of the part and the wholes, like Garth was saying, and that's definitely what we're on to. This is the part in the whole. But the way Hegel resolves everything is into simplicity. In other words, he wants us to accept, and it's up to us to do it. He wants us to accept that what he ends up with is always a simple whole. If this isn't a simple whole, at some point we're going to have to bail. We're going to have to say, well, Hegel doesn't quite toast our toast, or butter our toast, or whatever. We're going to have to, we need a better example of a simple whole from Hegel. He hasn't quite given us the simple whole that I thirst for. But on the other hand, I think he's doing a wonderful job of tying together the pictures that we get with reality, with our certainty of what reality is. And not only that, in this further chapter of perception, he's showing how kind of like giving us, I think, a really good example of how I hate to say it, but the pixelated view that Scott loves of reality, which is like there's going to be many different entities in the picture. And we're going to take Gestalt sometimes. We're just going to simply say it's a beautiful view behind us, or a beautiful view on a summer's day. It's not going to be, it's not always going to be complete discretes, but objects, then the simple objects are can be certain for us, and then and gives us a reason to believe that, providing we haven't spent too much time reading the complete works of Hume and then and Locke. And then he's also going to give us a reason to understand perception from the point of view that properties actually are in competition for our attention. And we're going to end up with a simple, again. We're going to end up with a new truth. But the truth is not going to be, the truth is going to be a very much customized one, but based on the competition between properties that we're actually witnessing in our from our senses and our observation.
And also that the object can actually be something, and yet it's also for us only in terms of having all its properties for us, but it's also something else, which is its own unity. So we have to hold that conflict together, and for that we have to we now have an object that didn't exist in sense certainty, right? Okay, so we have to be we're reflected in that in some way.
Right. Well, he's more interested. Yeah, he does say that the object reflects back to us, but in our minds, things get reflected back into themselves in Hegel's logic. So there's a time when the properties, there's a kind of a moment when the properties separate from each other, and like property of taste, property of sight, color, and so forth. And the properties tend to separate into their validity and wholeness, their uniqueness. And when this happens, there's a reflection. There's essentially a moment of reflection of the self into the self that's necessary in the object. So the object is going through a moment of reflection for us, in which the properties are being merged back into a unity, back into the whole. And then for us, the same thing has to happen on our side, but it's a reflection of our image of the properties back into the whole of the object. So in other words, to use Scott's, I'm doing you the great honor, Scott, your metaphor of the screen as being a metaphor for sensing is kind of like, here we can say that, like we're actually sensing the properties in a new unity, reflecting the new unity back into our universal sense of thingness. And he uses that language. He says it's the thingness that is recomposited from the movement of the properties. So in perception. No one has a hand up. What's the time? 9:44. We're doing pretty good on time. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things to discuss here. A lot of things that can be argued about. But what I'm saying is just that it's the text is not self-deficient. In other words, he's not always bringing up the absolute, the missing absolute that I'm going to talk about in the future chapter. That's not what these chapters are about. These chapters are about sense certainty and perception, and Hegel's way of seeing them produce simple objects of our consciousness. That's really what Hegel is about.
Well,
In other words, there's something out there, something happens in here, and this is the way consciousness has its own dialectic in order to reproduce that out there.
Yeah. Well, I would take you to at the end of the chapter and then go back, not to the very first paragraph at the end, but the one before that, which begins.
Oh, wow, that's a long paragraph.
Well, I'm not doing that paragraph. Go back before that.
The singular being of sense.
Sensible singleness, yes, thus disappears. Yeah, about halfway down that paragraph, it talks about the sophistry of perception seeks to save these moments from their contradiction. He's saying this is not good. This is not holding together. This is the mind playing with inadequate knowledge. And he's even telling you how bad it is, right? And we have to do better than this. Holding the also and the so fars together is like a unity, which was essential. So he's laying out the inadequacies after having said, this is the best you can do in perception, that we're stuck if we don't move forward because we haven't made it to what's going to be understanding yet. By understanding that there's what's behind is an essential part of what's in front, even though it's a unity, but I just described it as a duality. So as long as I have a unity and a duality, I'm trying to make the same thing. It's not done. It's not clear knowledge. I don't want to call it absolute. Okay, it's not even resolved. It has a dialectic he's described, a tension like positive and negative charges, but it's not a picture that's supposed to be torn apart in that way. It has no unity yet, and to make a unity, that's his goal. That's just why every time there's another chapter, right? So I don't know, I see it as a a drama.
Well, he's talking about deception. Now, I don't know. I didn't read this, so I can go back to what Finley says. There's, like I said, there's a Finley summary of the book at the end, which might be useful because it's shorter. He says, here's what Finley says. It's only a shorter paragraph. The sophistry of perception tries to save itself by a device of aspects and insofars. It talks of the perceived object insofar as it is one object, insofar as it is many properties, insofar as it is self-existence, insofar as it is related to other things, etc. So I mean that's saying a lot. So that's good so far, except for the word sophistry. This sort of device must be abandoned. So he says we're going to abandon the device of this comfortable device of perception. It is a pure universality of the begriff of the notion. Oh, the notion is the begriff, which emerges, which involves in an inseparable union. Oh, okay. The universal, the specific, and the singular. So the separate and the interrelated. So in other words, the thing, according to Finley, the thing that's coming, that we're all thirsting for, because of the sophistry of perception, whatever that is the notion. So kudos to the for you guys to see that, for David and also Roger also saw that to a certain extent. I think Roger was going a little too far, asking for the absolute. What we're looking for is a notion, and the notion is a idea that's previous to spirit, but the idea that there's a higher level of consciousness, a higher entity in consciousness that goes beyond concepts of things and properties, and which he calls the notion. So the notion is a kind of a resolution point for Hegel. And I suppose it's coming in the, like you said, it's probably coming in the chapter on force and understanding, like you said.
Tough chapter. Are we doing that one too?
I think we'll do that for next week, right? I think so. Makes sense. So we'll try to get to the end of force and understanding for sure by next week. And then after that is something that's dear to my heart: lordship and bonding. Well, my translation says lordship and bondage. So I think it's more politically correct. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the old one, yeah. Slave and master. So what is your general overall plan? How far are you going in this book? Are you like really going?
I'm planning on rereading the whole book. I'm lagging behind in my analysis, but you see me following it well. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna continue with the analysis. I'm really glad that I just discovered this today. At the end of this edition, there is a summary at the back of the edition, and it turns out it's pretty good. It's not that bad. It caught your point, and it caught my point that it's not about the absolute, but there is something that, but it does prove that he's looking for something that's a higher level that reconciles the kind of what he calls the sophistry. I'm going to have to finish reading to find out what that is. But it's, to me, this is just the most lovely book ever, because it illustrates several correct ways to view things, to actually have a theory of knowledge and epistemology that works. And it works by itself. It works for everybody. You don't need high levels of logical proficiency, like in as we do in what do you call that, analytic philosophy. We don't need the high levels of sophistry. Don't need high levels of sophistry like in Plato. We don't need high levels of analytical knowledge in order to use Hegel's system. We just have the ability to accept his use of the categories and be able to follow his logic, which, albeit, is a very difficult type of logic to follow, because it's actually the unfolding of things in reality back into consciousness. So in other words, the things in reality are active in themselves, and the active properties in reality that are actually unfolding and reflecting amongst themselves to each other are also reflecting that unfolding back into our consciousness. And our consciousness needs to find a place for this constant unfolding of reality. So once you grasp this, you see, well, yeah, I mean, everything that is changing in front of me is a unfolding, revision, cancellation, even cancellation of things that I've thought about things before, but I know that they were a deception, or I know they're a misperception, perhaps, because the word it uses is using is deception.
This is very helpful when you're talking to someone, they're telling you it's true. And you don't say, wait, you're lying. You say,
You don't say that right away. No.
you say, no, you don't say,
Yeah.
you wait until he tells us. But you say, well, I wonder if they're talking at their level of perception, or they have an understanding that they're asserting, or if they have, and this is true, I mean, you listen to an alt reasoner give you their truths, you have to say, okay, what are the perceptions that I share that I don't even have a perception that makes that true. What is it that you're seeing, oh, Q said, whatever it is, okay, you've got some sensation on that. This is very helpful in terms of parsing truth as not a word that has one meaning, but it's a level of comprehending something, and there is truth at that level. And you don't have to tell someone there's no truth for them to find out what that truth means in the context of their understanding. They may not even have understanding about it. They may have perception about it. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I forget if he actually gets into talking about language. I mean, in a sense, what he's doing now is talking about language, and in the introduction, I guess he's talking about language. So he doesn't really need to explicitly attack it. He doesn't. I don't think he has a chapter on logic or a chapter on unless it's in the notion. Maybe on the chapter on the notion, he actually explicates some further logic.
Well, the idea of deception would be after he does self-consciousness.
Right.
So I don't know where that'll come in. We'll see.
Yeah. It just elevates up to self-consciousness, the notion, and self-consciousness. These are really great topics, because the idea that there's a higher level of consciousness, which he calls self-consciousness, and which I don't know exactly know how he explains. I forget how he explains that and constitutes it. But it's like for me, I think when I was reading it before, it's like this constant unfolding of notions, and it's true. It is like a constant unfolding of notions. The way the book reads, but it's with good reason, because by explaining thisness and nowness, he's doing a lot to kind of quiet our skepticism. And the skepticism is kind of floating out the window, and we're gaining a new understanding of how we trust our own consciousness when we're when we're in a world.
Yeah,
it's
I think
a very valuable contribution.
I think his notion of self-consciousness, you're going to find it is wonderful, because it makes a real distinction between the infinite, which is a self-aware notion that it is a notion, by the way. That's an infinite relationship. So that's what you need for self-consciousness. I have to go, but thank you.
He finds an infinity. Yeah, thank you, David. Great evening. Wonderful. Well, anyone want to not leave, or we're at a pretty good, we have a high understanding of, I think, pretty good understanding of Hegel's opinion on the this, or the perceived objects and how they work, and how perceptions works. So pretty cool. We lost Lucas. Actually, he wrote a whole book tonight, as he usually does. So I'm gonna have to. I gotta save I gotta save the file. Save chat.
Yes, I'll just copy and paste because I'm a primitive. I didn't know you could save chat.
That's a good thing to be.
Yeah, well, I think ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's been demonstrated, hasn't it?
Who is saying bye? That was Lucas. Great. This is bliss. I don't know about that. No, it's just, I think Hegel's a wonderful example of like having to work very hard to achieve concepts.
Did you ever see a cartoon called Allegro non troppo? 70s Italian cartoon, big hit. Well,
I know what that means. Fast, but not too much. Not too fast.
Well, the cartoon has a series of sequences. One sequence is the snake comes up to Adam and Eve and offers the apple. Adam and Eve knock him back, so the snake eats it and develops civilization. And as far as he's concerned, by the 20th century, everything's just screwball. Eventually, he spits out the apple and just goes back to simplicity. Okay, I guess we'll be here next time.
Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful philosopher. Just very. Later on, we'll find some things that look absolutely mad. The idea of spirit rising to the highest levels, things like that. Kind of like become like madness. But it's kind of like noticing this progressive tendency in society that there is a progression in history, and most of the historians write the history that way. Nobody pretends that we're going to be cavemen pretty soon. It's all kind of like a story of moving.
So it's really a question of when the fossil fuel and fossil laws run out in a few hundred years time. I don't imagine they'll be economic anymore.
It's a question of what bullshit you prefer. I mean, there's a group in Nebraska that I used to belong to, and the guy that started the group it's called Rational is the name of the group. The guy that started the group was one of these population fanatics. He thought
Malthus type.
We were going to all die because of being too Malthusianism. Yeah. In other words, we have to die because of, for Malthus, it was vice, because people are so bad, especially the poor people, they're the worst, that we're going to, it's going to affect us very badly because the numbers don't lie.
I have a cunning plan.
Yeah.
The cunning plan is we convince much of the population that they're the other gender, then we give them all sex change operations and they can no longer breed. I think that this is actually the plan that is being carried out. So only certain types, I'll probably go that certain types are allowed to produce offspring. It's starting to sound a bit like Brave New World, isn't it?
Yeah, you can have a brave new world. No, there's no question that things are possible that aren't present. You can have hybrid plants, hybrid creatures, hybrid viruses. You don't have to. Viruses don't breed, but I mean, anything that breeds, you can have a hybrid.
They reproduce.
And they reproduce with the help of cells. They reproduce. They're not cells. They need a cell to reproduce. And so the idea is that all these things are going to, have their own day. Everything has its day, and you can have completely wacky societies spring up from time to time, like for example, the Greek society, the Christian society, the Roman Empire, and self-destructive, essentially self-destructive societies that arise in history, not necessarily from the same
You think the Romans were self-destructive?
principle. Eventually, they split into two different empires. You know that, right? So they split into two empires.
I agree with the decision.
Of one emperor. Yeah.
I think it was.
Well,
I think the western half was just the dead twin that they had to
cast
adrift.
The dead twin. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was costing.
Yeah, obviously, because it didn't last. It didn't last as long. The one that persisted is the Eastern Empire. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
The Eastern Empire had the fundamentals to support itself. The Western Empire was just a money drain in the end. The thing which had created the West had been Spain and its enormous reserves of minerals. When the silver ran out, well, the West was no longer viable. When the East got rid of the West, they lowered taxation and their economy recovered. They had obviously knew of Ronald Reagan's ideas. They developed Reaganism and their economy recovered. And when they finally had enough money to send an army off to defeat the Huns, or at least get a bit of a draw going, they just basically couldn't field an army against the Huns. And once they just got strong enough again, they could put an army together, and the Huns decided to go elsewhere. And so, yeah, the Eastern Empire was saved until Justinian, the stupid fool, a century later, went and started a whole series of wars again. But I think basically the Roman Empire, its problem was that it just stripped the surface deposits of all the minerals and that it was using. It wasn't until really they developed the steam pump. What was it? Newcomen's steam pump. The British took the steam pump down to the old Roman gold workings and got the water table down and started making themselves rich. That was Rio Tinto.
Rio Tinto, the origin of Rio Tinto.
Yeah, well, that's my argument. That even though the late empire was a degenerate, a huge factor was just the lack of resources, the lack of metals, for example. I think iron had become a lot more scarce. You need iron to work. If you work, you got iron tools to work farmland, and you got no iron tools to work farmland. Which one's going to produce a successful produce? The one with the iron tools. I think there was a lot of land that was just going fallow because they could no longer work it at a surplus. They seem to recover a bit in the late Dark Ages. I think in part it was because even characters like the Vikings were starting to bring in trade goods from parts of the world that hadn't been stripped by the Romans. And so that was the recovery. Anyway, yeah, enough of that.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think
I think the Vikings. Yeah, they had a lot of
they went to regions which hadn't seen any sort of technology. I could have to conclude that the Vikings had picked up on technologies which were beyond their par, but somehow, maybe they got it off the Byzantines or something like that, for all I know.
Right. Yeah, they're definitely kind of more. They're semi-moderns in that sense. Yeah, they did a very good job with technology, and they did they had a religion. They had a religion that was very integrated into their lifestyle.
Oh, well, they become Christians. Curiously, this is a fascinating thing, that the advanced blast furnace, there is a claim that it might have originated in Sweden. And this was the type of blast furnace which delivered your pig iron at a more consistent level of carbon of about 2%. In other words, you're producing a massive pig iron that was workable. didn't have an excess of carbon in it due to the process that was used. So they're saying that that was developed in Sweden in the 12th century, and that was barely out of the Viking era. So suddenly a progression occurred in technology which began to bypass everything else. And finally, was by the 14th century that I think they had more or less this process pretty down pat. It was in other countries, and because of this, they could, you know, create pieces of pig iron which are quite large. What can you do then? Beat it out in the huge plates and fully enclosed knights in armour. This was something the Europeans were doing, which doesn't seem to have been replicated anywhere else. And this was what I think gave the Europeans a head start. There was this, you know, just availability of iron. Hey, dude, you need some pig iron. Here we are at lower prices. Here, take all the pig iron you like. I've checked the prices. Iron dropped in Sweden. The price of iron dropped 7 times from the year 1350 to 1720. That just means vastly greater ability. I mean, unless you've got the material, you're not going to do very much. If you've got the material, you can start to do stuff. Everybody else, it's ideology. They think every invention's just an idea. No, you need the material to make the stuff.
Great.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's time to go then. You made me host, so I'm going.
Wonderful material host, and he made material point of view. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here, Jamelia and Natalia.
Okay, here we go. End meeting for all.